Nobody wants to dance with a cripple. Victor Kane said it loud enough for the whole room to hear. He smiled when he said it, like it was a joke. The men around him laughed with their drinks still in their hands. Amelia Whitmore sat in her wheelchair in the middle of the ballroom floor, and every single person in that room was looking at her. Her father stood across the room. 2 years he had waited for his daughter to walk into a room full of people again. 2 years of doctors who gave up. 2 years of watching her stop smiling. Tonight was supposed to be the night she came back to life. Instead, it became the night she wanted to disappear. Nobody moved to help her. Not one person. Then a boy in a plain black uniform stepped out from the wall where nobody was supposed to notice him. He was just hired security. Nobody important. Nobody knew his name. He walked straight across that dance floor while 200 people watched. He knelt down in front of her. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "would you still like that dance?" Nobody in that room knew what he was about to do next would change both their lives forever, and uncover a 15-year-old secret that someone in that very room had killed to protect. Hi friends, welcome to the channel. If this story touches your heart, please like and subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments. Have you ever been counted out by someone who was supposed to protect you? Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I leave no comment unread. The Harbor Festival Gala was the biggest night of the year in Blackwater Harbor. Every rich family in town came, every business owner, every politician. The room was full of gold lights and long dresses and waiters carrying trays of champagne. Amelia Whitmore had not come to a party like this in almost 2 years. 2 years ago, a storm hit the harbor. A storm that took ships, took lives, and took the use of Amelia's legs. Since that night, she had not been seen in public. People whispered about her at the market. They whispered about her at church. Some felt sorry for her. Some, quietly, made fun of her behind closed doors. Tonight, her father wanted that to end. Mason Whitmore was one of the richest men in the harbor. He owned half the shipping company that kept the town alive. He had tried everything to help his daughter walk again. Doctors from 3 different cities. Specialists who flew in on private planes. Nothing worked. But tonight, he hoped a different kind of medicine would help her. Being seen, being around people again, maybe even smiling again. He stood up in front of the whole room, raised his glass, and said the words that would ruin the entire night. "Tonight, I would like my daughter to open the ceremonial captain's dance." The room went quiet. The captain's dance was an old harbor tradition. Every year, someone opened the festival with it. It was meant to be an honor. A symbol. The whole town watched whoever danced it. Mason looked at his daughter with hope in his eyes. He thought this would be the moment she came back to life. Instead, it became a trap. Nobody stood up. Mason waited. He smiled at the crowd, expecting some young man to step forward and ask his daughter for the dance, like men used to do before the storm. But no one moved. One man near the bar shook his head and looked away. Another laughed quietly to his friend and said nothing. Another just stared at his shoes. 10 seconds passed. It felt like 10 minutes. Amelia sat there in her wheelchair, in the middle of the dance floor, in her blue dress that her father bought for this exact night, and she understood what was happening before anyone said a single word. Nobody was going to dance with her. Her face turned red. Her hands gripped the wheels of her chair. She wanted to leave. She wanted to roll herself right out of that ballroom and never come back. But she couldn't move without making it worse. So she just sat there, frozen, while 200 people watched her be humiliated in silence. Then Victor Kane stepped forward. For 1 second, hope returned to the room. Victor was young, rich, and the mayor's son. Everyone assumed he was about to be the hero. Everyone assumed he would ask her to dance just to save the moment. He didn't. He raised his glass and looked straight at her. "Let's stop pretending," he said, loud enough for the whole ballroom to hear. "Nobody wants to dance with a captain who can't even stand on her own deck." A few people gasped. A few people laughed. Worse than the gasping, worse than the laughing, was the silence that came after. Nobody told him to stop. Nobody defended her. Mason's face went pale with anger. He opened his mouth to say something, to throw Victor out of the building, to do anything. But it was already too late. The damage was done the moment the words left Victor's mouth. A tear rolled down Amelia's cheek. She wiped it fast, like she was ashamed of crying in front of everyone. But more tears followed. She stared at the floor, wishing the ground would just open up and take her away from all those eyes. This was supposed to be the night she came back to life. Instead, it was the worst night of the 2 years since the storm. Nobody in that ballroom saw the boy standing near the side door. Nobody ever noticed him. He wasn't a guest. He wasn't important. He worked security for the event, hired for the night just to stand near the exits and make sure nothing went wrong. His name was Elijah. Elijah had grown up in Blackwater Harbor his whole life. His father used to be a fisherman, and a good one, until he disappeared during the same storm that took Amelia's ability to walk. 15 years before that storm, his mother had spent years working with injured sailors, men who lost legs and arms in accidents at sea, men everyone else gave up on. She taught Elijah things most people in this town never learned. Things about the body, things about balance, things about how to give someone their strength back, piece by piece, without ever pretending to perform a miracle. Elijah never thought he would need any of that knowledge standing in a ballroom in a cheap black uniform, watching a rich man humiliate a girl in a wheelchair. But something inside him broke when he heard Victor's words. He remembered his father's voice from years ago, before the storm took him. His father used to say that the strongest people in any room are often the quietest ones. And the loudest people, the ones throwing insults to get a laugh, are usually the weakest. Elijah looked at Amelia, really looked at her, past the tears, past the wheelchair. He saw a person being treated like she didn't matter in front of everyone who was supposed to care about her. He started walking, not fast, not dramatic, just calm, steady steps across the marble floor, while 200 people turned to watch him. Victor saw him coming and laughed. "Look, boys," Victor said to his friends, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Security's about to wheel her out for us." A few people laughed along with him. Amelia closed her eyes, certain that this stranger was simply coming to take her away from the floor, to remove her from the room like a piece of furniture nobody wanted to look at anymore. Elijah reached her. He didn't grab the handles of her chair. He knelt down in front of her instead, until his eyes were level with hers. The whole room went silent again, but this silence felt different from before. This one felt like the room was holding its breath. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, just for her to hear. "Would you still like that dance?" Amelia stared at him. For a moment she thought she had misheard him. Nobody had asked her that question all night. Nobody had even looked at her like she was still a person who could be asked such a thing. I can't stand," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Everyone can see that. Why are you doing this?" "You don't have to stand the way you think you do," Elijah said. "Just trust me for 30 seconds. If it doesn't work, I'll walk away and nobody will say another word about it." Victor's laughter had stopped. He watched with his jaw tight, suddenly unsure what was happening. Mason Whitmore stood frozen near his table, his heart pounding, watching a boy he had never met kneel in front of his daughter with more kindness than anyone else in that entire room had shown her in 2 years. Amelia looked into Elijah's eyes. There was something steady there, something that didn't feel like pity. It felt like respect. She gave a small nod. Elijah reached for her hands, gently, and showed her how to shift her weight using her arms and the strength still left in her hips. A technique his mother had taught injured sailors years ago, something no doctor in 3 different cities had ever tried with her. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a miracle. It was simply something nobody had bothered to teach her before. Slowly, carefully, with Elijah's hands supporting her, Amelia rose to her feet. The entire ballroom gasped. She wobbled unsteady, holding onto his arms like they were the only solid thing in the world. But she was standing. For the first time in 2 years, in front of every person who had whispered about her, she was on her feet. Elijah held her steady, and slowly, carefully, he began to move with her. It wasn't a full dance. It was barely more than swaying in place, but it was enough. Enough for the room to see a girl who everyone had given up on, standing tall in a blue dress, moving with quiet grace beside a boy nobody in that room had ever bothered to learn the name of. Mason Whitmore's eyes filled with tears. 2 years of hope, finally answered, not by a doctor, not by a specialist flown in on a private plane, but by a security guard standing near a side door. Victor's face turned red with anger and something else, something that looked a lot like jealousy. Someone in the crowd started filming on their phone. By the next morning, that video would be everywhere. But in that moment, none of that mattered. Amelia wasn't thinking about cameras or whispers or Victor's cruel words anymore. She was looking into the eyes of a boy whose name she didn't even know yet, feeling something she hadn't felt in 2 long years. Hope. When the music stopped, Elijah carefully helped her sit back down. Her legs were shaking from the effort, but her face was glowing in a way nobody in that room had seen since before the storm. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't even know your name." "Elijah," he said simply. She would remember that name for the rest of her life. What Amelia didn't know that night, what nobody in that ballroom knew, was that Elijah's father had disappeared in the very same storm that put her in that wheelchair. And the reason he disappeared had nothing to do with bad weather. Somebody in that town had made sure he never came home. And somebody in that very ballroom, watching Elijah and Amelia that night with cold, careful eyes, knew exactly why. When the room went quiet and Amelia needed somebody to stand up for her, everyone looked away. Except one person. When the room goes quiet and someone needs you to stand up, do you? Subscribe to this channel because we tell stories like this one every week. By morning, Elijah was no longer invisible. The video from the gala spread across the whole town overnight. People who never noticed him before now stopped him on the street. They wanted to shake his hand. They wanted to take pictures with him. The boy nobody knew the name of one day before was suddenly the most talked about man in Blackwater Harbor. Elijah didn't enjoy the attention. He went back to his small house near the docks, the same house he grew up in, and tried to live his normal life. He still had bills to pay. He still had his grandfather to take care of. He still had his younger sister Sophia to look after, even though she was nearly old enough to take care of herself. But normal life didn't last long. 3 days after the gala, a letter arrived at his door. Plain white envelope. No name on the front, just his address written in neat handwriting. Inside was a short note. "Thank you for what you did. I would like to thank you in person if you are willing. Amelia Whitmore." Elijah read it twice. He folded it and put it in his pocket, and for the first time in a long while, he smiled without trying to stop himself. They met at a small cafe near the harbor, the kind of place fishermen went after long nights at sea. Amelia chose it on purpose, not the fancy restaurants her family usually went to. She wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere normal. When Elijah walked in, he found her already sitting at a corner table, her wheelchair tucked close, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. "You came," she said, smiling. "You wrote a letter," he said. "That's hard to ignore." She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised even her. They talked for almost 2 hours that day. Not about the storm, not about her legs, not about the cruel words Victor said at the gala. They talked about small things, her favorite books, his favorite fishing spots as a kid, the way the harbor smelled different in the morning compared to the evening. For the first time in 2 years, Amelia wasn't talking to someone who treated her like she was broken. For the first time in years, Elijah wasn't talking to someone who looked through him like he didn't exist. They were both lonely in their own way. And somehow, without planning it, they understood each other. That one meeting became 2. Then 3. Then it became something they both looked forward to every week. Stor Wars Svordy Hugor. Not everyone was happy about it. Victor Kane heard about the meetings within days. Blackwater Harbor was a small town, and nothing stayed secret for long. The mayor's son didn't like what he was hearing. Not one bit. Victor had always assumed Amelia would belong to him eventually. Not because he loved her, because it made sense to him. Her family had the money. His family had the power. Together, the Whitmores and the Kanes would control the entire harbor. That was the plan in his head, even if Amelia never agreed to it. Now some nobody security guard was ruining everything. Victor decided Elijah needed to disappear from Amelia's life. Quietly, completely. He started with Elijah's job. The harbor authority that hired security for events like the gala answered to people connected to the mayor's office. One phone call from Victor, dressed up as a concern about professionalism, and Elijah's contract was suddenly terminated. No real reason given, just a short letter saying his services were no longer needed. Elijah didn't fight it. He needed money too badly to waste time arguing with people who had already decided. But Victor wasn't finished. He visited 3 different local business owners that same week. Quiet conversations, friendly smiles, subtle threats hidden behind polite words. Within days, every business in town that might have hired Elijah suddenly had no openings. No explanations, just closed doors. Mayor Kane backed his son's efforts without asking too many questions. He had learned a long time ago not to ask Victor what he was doing, as long as it kept the family's name clean and their power secure. Elijah felt the walls closing in fast. Bills piled up. His grandfather's medicine wasn't cheap. Sophia was saving for journalism school, money she now quietly handed back to help the family instead. He never told Amelia how bad things had gotten. He didn't want her pity. He had enough pride to suffer in silence. But Amelia noticed anyway. She noticed the worry behind his eyes during their meetings. She noticed how his jacket looked thinner than it used to, like he was skipping meals to save money. She noticed when he mentioned, just once, that he might need to leave the harbor to find work somewhere else. That thought terrified her more than she expected. So she did something about it. Using her family's name quietly, without telling her father exactly why, Amelia arranged a position for Elijah at one of the smaller shipping offices her family partly controlled. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention, just enough to keep him afloat. When Elijah found out, he was upset at first. He didn't want charity. He didn't want to be someone's project. "I didn't do it because I felt sorry for you," Amelia told him, her voice firm. "I did it because you're the first person who ever treated me like I still matter. I'm not going to sit back and watch you struggle while I have the power to help." Elijah looked at her for a long moment. Something in his chest shifted. For years, he had been the one helping others, his grandfather, his sister, strangers at the harbor who needed an extra hand. He wasn't used to someone standing beside him, fighting for him. It was a strange, warm feeling, one he didn't quite know what to do with. "Thank you," he finally said. "Nobody's done something like that for me before." "Then I guess it's about time someone did," she said softly. That same week, Elijah finally opened something he had avoided for 15 years. His father's old journal. After the storm took his father, the harbor authorities declared him lost at sea. No body, no explanation. Just a brief report that blamed the weather and moved on. Elijah was only 10 years old at the time, too young to understand the loss, but old enough to remember his mother crying every night for months. The journal had survived. It washed up weeks after the storm, soaked and damaged, tucked inside a small waterproof box his father always carried on his boat. For 15 years, it sat in a drawer, untouched, because Elijah couldn't bring himself to read his father's last thoughts. But that night, sitting alone in his quiet house, he finally opened it. Most of the pages were normal. Notes about weather patterns, notes about fish migration, small drawings of boats and harbor maps, the kind any fisherman might keep. Then, near the final pages, the writing changed. His father had started noting strange shipping schedules. Boats arriving at odd hours, unloading cargo nobody else seemed to track. Containers marked with symbols Elijah didn't recognize. A list of names, some of them familiar people still living in the harbor today. One name stood out more than the others. Kane. Written not once but multiple times, alongside dates and numbers that meant nothing to Elijah on their own. The final entry, dated just 2 days before the storm that took him, simply said, "I think I finally understand what's really happening at the South Docks. I need to talk to someone before this gets worse. If anything happens to me, look at the records from the old warehouse." Elijah sat there for a long time, staring at those words. His father hadn't simply disappeared in a storm. His father had been afraid of something, afraid enough to write it down, afraid enough that his final thoughts weren't about his family, but about a warning he never got the chance to deliver. The next morning, Elijah brought the journal to Captain Samuel Reed. Reed was an old harbor captain, one of the few men in town who had known Elijah's father personally. He had spent 30 years sailing these waters, and he had a reputation for noticing things other people overlooked. Reed's face changed the moment he saw the symbols drawn next to the shipping schedules. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. "My father's old journal. He wrote it right before the storm took him." Reed flipped through the pages slowly, his hands trembling slightly. He recognized those symbols. He had seen them once before, years ago, on containers that came through the South Docks late at night, containers that were never properly logged in the official harbor records. "Elijah," Reed said, his voice low and serious, "I think your father wasn't just lost in that storm. I think he found something he wasn't supposed to find." Elijah felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" Reed closed the journal carefully. There were always rumors, whispers about illegal cargo moving through the South Docks, things that disappeared into trucks at 3 a.m. Nobody ever proved anything. Nobody dared to look too closely. Your father might have looked closer than anyone. "Are you saying someone hurt him? On purpose?" Reed didn't answer right away. He looked out toward the harbor, toward the same waters that had taken so many lives, including the one man who might have known the truth. "I'm saying we need to be very careful who we talk to about this," Reed finally said. "And I'm saying you should keep that journal somewhere safe. Better yet, make copies, just in case." That night, following Reed's advice, Elijah carefully photographed every page of the journal with his old phone. He saved the pictures in 3 different places, a habit that would matter more than he realized. 2 nights later, Elijah came home from a long shift to find his front door already open. His heart dropped. The house had been searched, drawers pulled open, furniture moved. Whoever did it wasn't trying to steal money or valuables. The small amount of cash he kept in a kitchen jar was untouched. Only one thing was missing: the journal. Elijah stood in his torn-apart living room, his hands shaking, not from fear but from anger. Someone had been watching him. Someone knew exactly what he found, and exactly where he kept it. He immediately thought of the photographs. He grabbed his phone, his hands trembling as he checked. Still there. All of them. Whoever broke in didn't know about the copies. That single decision, made on Captain Reed's advice, would end up being the only thing standing between the truth and a secret somebody was willing to break into a man's home to protect. Elijah called Amelia that same night. His voice was tense, careful, trying not to scare her with how serious this had suddenly become. "Someone broke into my house," he said. "They took my father's journal." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Elijah," Amelia said slowly, "do you think this has something to do with what happened to your father?" "I think it has everything to do with it," he said. "And I think whoever did this knows I'm getting close to something they don't want found." Another pause. When Amelia spoke again, her voice had changed. It wasn't soft anymore. It was determined. "Then I'm helping you find it," she said. "Whatever this is, whoever is behind it, we're doing this together." Elijah wanted to tell her no. He wanted to protect her from whatever danger was circling closer with each passing day. But he also remembered what she told him just days earlier about wanting to be someone who mattered, someone who fought for the people she cared about. He couldn't take that away from her now. "Okay," he said quietly. "Together." Neither of them knew yet how far this would go. Neither of them knew that the break-in was only a warning, a small one, compared to what was still coming. Somewhere across town, in a large house overlooking the harbor, Victor Kane sat by his window, holding a worn leather journal in his hands. He flipped through the damaged pages slowly, his face tight with worry. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he rarely called. "Father," he said when the line connected, "we have a problem." News travels fast in a small town, and nothing travels faster than gossip about money, power, and a girl everyone thought would never love again. Within a week, the entire town of Blackwater Harbor was talking about Amelia Whitmore and Elijah. At first, people called it sweet. A rich man's daughter and the boy who gave her back her dignity. A real-life fairy tale, they said, sipping their coffee at the local diner. But fairy tales don't stay sweet for long when someone powerful decides to ruin them. Victor made sure of that. Victor never raised his voice in public anymore. He had learned a better way to fight. Quiet words, careful rumors, a whisper here, a suggestion there. Poison doesn't need to be loud to kill something. He started with the men who worked the docks. You know, he's only doing this for her money, Victor said one afternoon, leaning against a stack of crates, talking to a group of dock workers, like he was simply making conversation. Poor boy loses his job. Suddenly the richest girl in town is paying his bills? Come on. Open your eyes. The workers laughed along, not because they believed it, but because disagreeing with the mayor's son wasn't smart if you wanted to keep your job. By the end of the week, that small comment had grown into a full story. Elijah is using her. He's after the Whitmore fortune. He probably planned that whole gala moment from the start. The story spread through the harbor like fire through dry grass. Each person who repeated it added a little more to make it juicier. By the time it reached the church ladies and the shop owners, the story had grown teeth. Some people stopped greeting Elijah on the street. A few who once shook his hand now crossed to the other side instead. Elijah heard the whispers everywhere he went. He tried to ignore them. He told himself the truth would always win in the end. But after the fifth person turned their back on him in a single afternoon, even his strong shoulders began to feel tired. What hurt the worst wasn't the rumors about himself. It was knowing they were also hurting Amelia. Amelia felt it too. Old friends of her family suddenly had less time for tea. Invitations that used to arrive weekly slowed down to almost nothing. At a charity event for the hospital, two women whispered behind their hands as she rolled past them, just loud enough for her to catch fragments. Probably paying him just to be seen with her. Desperate, if you ask me. Amelia kept her chin high and pretended not to hear. But that night, alone in her room, she cried harder than she had in a long time. Not because of what people thought of her, because of what they were doing to Elijah's name. A man who only ever showed her kindness was now being painted as a liar and a thief in the eyes of the entire town. The next day, she went straight to Victor's house. She didn't call ahead. She rolled herself right up to his front door and knocked, her hands shaking from anger more than nerves. When Victor opened the door, he smiled like he had been expecting her. "Amelia," he said smoothly, "come to apologize for embarrassing yourself with the help?" "Stop the rumors," she said flatly. "Now." "What rumors?" Victor asked, feigning confusion, though his smirk gave him away completely. "You know exactly what I mean. Elijah isn't using me for anything. He never asked me for a single coin. You're the one spreading lies because you can't stand that I chose him over you." Victor's smile faded slightly. The truth landed closer than he wanted to admit. "You think that boy actually cares about you?" Victor said, his voice colder now. "Open your eyes, Amelia. You're a Whitmore. Men like him don't fall in love with girls like you. They fall in love with what girls like you can give them." "That's exactly something you would say," Amelia shot back. "Because that's all you ever cared about. Money, power, control. You never once cared about me as a person. Not before the storm, not after it." Victor's jaw tightened. "Careful," he said quietly. "You don't know what you're dealing with." "And you don't know who you're dealing with," Amelia replied. "Because if anything happens to Elijah or his family, I will make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of person you really are." She turned and rolled away before he could respond, leaving Victor standing in his doorway, his fists clenched, his mind already turning toward darker plans than rumors. Meanwhile, Elijah's younger sister, Sophia, was busy with her own investigation. Sophia had always wanted to be a journalist. She spent most of her free time at the small-town library, going through old newspaper archives, dreaming of the day she would write stories that actually mattered. After the break-in at their house, after seeing how shaken her brother had become, Sophia decided it was time to use those skills for something real. She started with the storm that took their father. The local newspaper had covered it extensively at the time. Front-page stories, photos of damaged boats, interviews with grieving families. But as Sophia dug deeper into the archive boxes in the library basement, she noticed something strange. Several articles were missing. Not damaged, not lost. Simply gone, as if someone had carefully removed specific pages from specific issues, leaving the rest of the newspaper intact. She mentioned it to the elderly librarian, Mrs. Holloway, who had worked there for almost 40 years. "Oh, I remember that," Mrs. Holloway said, lowering her voice like she was sharing a secret. "A man came in, must have been about 10 years ago, said he was doing research for the mayor's office. Asked to see our storm coverage. A week later, I noticed pages were missing from the archive. Never could prove it was him, but I always wondered. Sophia's heart raced. Do you remember his name? Mrs. Halloway thought for a long moment. No, dear, but I remember he drove a car with the Kane family symbol on it. The same crest the mayor uses on his official papers. Sophia wrote everything down the moment she got home. If someone connected to the Kane family had removed newspaper articles about the storm a decade after it happened, that meant someone was still worried about what those articles contained. Worried enough to hide evidence years later. She brought her findings straight to Elijah. Someone erased parts of our history, she told him, and it wasn't random. Whoever did this was trying to protect something specific. Elijah thought of his father's journal entry. I think I finally understand what's really happening at the South Docks. The pieces were slowly connecting, even if the full picture remained hidden in shadows. While the investigation grew, so did the bond between Amelia and Elijah. She started visiting his house more often, getting to know his grandfather, an old fisherman who told stories about the harbor from 60 years ago, back when the docks were simpler and the water felt safer. She watched Elijah help Sophia with her studies in the evening, patiently explaining math problems even after a long, tiring day of work. She saw him stop on the way home one evening to help an elderly dock worker carry heavy crates, refusing any payment for it, simply because the old man looked tired. None of it was for show. None of it was performed for cameras or crowds. It was simply who Elijah was, day after day, when nobody important was watching. Amelia found herself falling for him in a way she never expected. It wasn't loud or dramatic like the love stories she used to read before the storm. It was quiet, steady, the kind of love built on 100 small moments instead of one big gesture. One evening, sitting on the porch of his small house, watching the sun go down over the harbor, Amelia finally said what she had been feeling for weeks. You know, she said softly, before the storm, I thought my life was already figured out. Marry someone like Victor, run my father's business, live a comfortable, predictable life. And now? Elijah asked. Now I don't know what my life looks like anymore, she said. But for the first time in 2 years, I'm not scared of that. Because of you. Elijah looked at her for a long moment, the orange light of the sunset reflecting in his eyes. I never imagined someone like you would even notice someone like me, he admitted. Let alone feel something real. I think real doesn't care about money or family names, Amelia said. Real just happens, quietly, without permission. Neither of them said the words out loud that night, but both of them felt it, sitting there together, watching the harbor turn gold and then dark. Something neither of them could ignore anymore. 2 days later, Sophia made the discovery that changed everything. She had been searching through old donation records from the Harbor Restoration Fund, a charity set up right after the storm to help rebuild damaged docks and support grieving families. It was supposed to be Mayor Kane's proudest achievement, a symbol of how the town came together after tragedy. But buried inside old financial records, Sophia found a single photograph that had been misfiled, tucked behind unrelated paperwork from over a decade ago. The photograph showed Mayor Kane standing on the South Docks shortly after the storm, surveying the damage alongside harbor officials. Standing beside him, shaking his hand, was a man Sophia recognized immediately from old newspaper clippings about a smuggling case from a neighboring town years earlier. A man known throughout the region for moving illegal cargo through small, unguarded harbors. A man who had no business standing beside the mayor of Blackwater Harbor, smiling, shaking hands, like old friends sharing a private understanding. Sophia stared at the photo for a long time, her hands trembling. This wasn't just rumors anymore. This was proof that Mayor Kane had a direct connection to exactly the kind of illegal activity their father had written about in his final journal entries. The same activity he was investigating right before the storm took him. She immediately called Elijah. You need to see this, she said, her voice shaking. I think I just found out why our father really disappeared. Elijah rushed straight to her, his heart pounding the entire way. When he saw the photograph, when he recognized the connection his sister had uncovered, a cold, heavy feeling settled into his chest. His father hadn't simply uncovered some random crime. His father had uncovered something connected directly to the mayor of their town. Something powerful enough that 15 years later, people were still willing to break into a house and steal evidence to protect it. "We can't tell anyone about this yet," Elijah said quietly. "Not until we understand exactly what we're dealing with. If the mayor is involved, we need real proof. Something nobody can deny or destroy." Sophia nodded, her journalist instincts already working. "I'll keep digging, carefully this time." Elijah looked at the photograph one more time, at the mayor's relaxed smile next to a known criminal, and felt something harden inside him that hadn't been there before. This wasn't just about his father's memory anymore. This was about a truth this town deserved to know, no matter how powerful the people trying to bury it really were. That same week, on a rare quiet evening with Amelia, Elijah finally told her everything Sophia had discovered. The missing newspaper articles, the photograph, the connection to his father's final journal entry. Amelia listened in silence, her chest tightening with every detail. When he finished, she reached for his hand. "Elijah," she said quietly, "if the mayor really had something to do with what happened to your father, that means Victor might know more than he's letting on to." Elijah hadn't considered that. But the moment she said it, it felt true in a way that made his stomach turn. Victor's strange obsession with destroying Elijah's reputation, his desperate attempt to keep Amelia away from him. It wasn't only about jealousy. Maybe Victor had a reason far darker to want Elijah gone for good. Outside the window, storm clouds were beginning to gather over the harbor, dark and heavy, the kind of clouds the old fishermen always warned meant something big was coming. Nobody in Blackwater Harbor yet understood just how big. If you're still watching and you're rooting for Elijah and Amelia right now, tap that like button. They've earned it. Show this story some love with a like and comment "Justice for Elijah" if you believe the truth is going to come out. The storm warnings started on a Tuesday. By Thursday, every radio station in the region was repeating the same message. A massive hurricane was building out at sea, and it was heading straight for Blackwater Harbor. The last storm like this had taken Elijah's father. This one was about to take much more. Mason Whitmore had business to attend to that week. A shipping deal with a partner company 3 islands away, the kind of deal that needed his signature in person, not over the phone. He had planned the trip weeks in advance, long before anyone knew a hurricane was coming. Amelia insisted on going with him. "You don't need to," Mason told her. "Stay home, it's safer." "I'm not letting you go alone," Amelia said firmly. "Not with a storm coming. If something happens, I want to be there." Mason argued for a while, but in the end he gave in. He always had a hard time saying no to his daughter, especially now that he was finally seeing her smile again. They left on Wednesday morning, along with a small crew and 2 other members of the Whitmore Shipping Company. The trip out was calm. The deal went smoothly. But by the time they began the trip back, the storm had grown faster and stronger than anyone predicted. What was supposed to be a quiet business trip turned into a fight for survival. Elijah heard the news Thursday evening, standing in his kitchen with Sophia, both of them watching the storm reports on an old television that barely held a signal. "They said a Whitmore Company ship left port 2 days ago," the reporter said. "Officials are attempting to confirm the location and safety of everyone aboard." Elijah's blood went cold. He called Amelia immediately. No answer. He called again. Still nothing. He tried Mason's office. The secretary, her voice tight with worry, confirmed what he feared. "Mr. Whitmore and his daughter are still out at sea. The ship lost radio contact almost 3 hours ago." Elijah dropped the phone. He ran straight to the Harbor Authority office, his heart pounding harder with every step. Captain Reed was already there, along with several other experienced sailors, all of them staring at maps and storm tracking reports with grim expressions. "We need to send a rescue ship," Elijah said the moment he walked through the door. "Now." The harbor official in charge, a nervous man named Coleman, shook his head. "We can't authorize a rescue mission in this weather. The risk is too high. We'd be sending men straight into a hurricane." "There are people out there," Elijah said, his voice rising. "Amelia is out there." "I understand your concern," Coleman said carefully, "but this decision has to come from the mayor's office, and the mayor has already advised against it." Elijah felt his stomach twist. Mayor Kane had refused to approve the rescue. He thought of Victor instantly. Of course Victor would support his father's decision. If Amelia disappeared in that storm, all of Victor's problems would simply disappear with her. "This is insane," Elijah said. "You're letting people die because of paperwork?" "It's not paperwork," Coleman said quietly, looking almost ashamed of himself. "It's politics. And right now, politics says we wait." Elijah turned to Captain Reed, desperation written across his face. Reed's jaw was tight, his old eyes filled with a familiar anger. Elijah recognized from years of watching the man deal with harbor bureaucracy. "I'm not waiting," Reed said finally. "I've lost too many good men to storms because someone upstairs was too afraid to act in time. Not again." He turned to the small group of fishermen gathered nearby, men who had spent their entire lives on these waters, men who respected Reed more than they respected any official title. "Who's coming with me?" Reed asked. Every single one of them stepped forward. The harbor authority refused to officially support the rescue, but they couldn't physically stop a group of private fishermen from taking their own boats out, especially with Captain Reed leading them. It was dangerous, it was against advice, but it was the only chance anyone had. Elijah climbed aboard without hesitation. "You don't have to come," Reed told him as they paired the boat. "You're not trained for something like this." "She's out there because of who she is to me," Elijah said. "I'm not staying behind." Reed studied him for a moment, then nodded. There wasn't time to argue further. They left the harbor just as the storm began crashing into the coastline, rain falling sideways, wind screaming louder than Elijah had ever heard in his life. Out at sea, the Whitmore ship was already in serious trouble. The engine had taken damage hours earlier, leaving the crew with limited control as massive waves crashed against the hull. Mason held tightly onto a railing, his other arm wrapped protectively around Amelia, both of them soaked from the rain pouring down in sheets. "We're going to be okay," Mason said, though his voice shook with every word. Amelia didn't answer. She was staring at the dark waves rising around them, taller than she had ever imagined waves could be, and for the first time since the storm that took her ability to walk, she felt true fear grip her chest. Not fear for herself. Fear that she would die without ever telling Elijah how she truly felt. The ship lurched violently as another wave crashed across the deck. Crew members shouted, scrambling to secure loose equipment. Mason lost his footing for a moment, nearly falling overboard before another crew member grabbed his arm just in time. "Father!" Amelia screamed, gripping the arms of her wheelchair so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I'm all right," Mason said, though his face had gone pale with the close call. The captain of the ship, a steady man named Briggs, shouted orders to his crew, trying desperately to keep the vessel pointed in a direction that wouldn't capsize them completely. But the engine kept failing, sputtering weakly against the force of the storm, leaving them drifting closer and closer to dangerous rocks near the coastline. "We need rescue," Briggs shouted over the wind. "We can't fix this engine in time." Nobody knew yet that rescue was already on its way, fighting through the same brutal waves to reach them. Reed's boat fought through waves taller than the boat itself. Elijah held on with everything he had, his hands raw from gripping the railing, salt water burning his eyes every time a wave crashed over the deck. "There!" one of the fishermen shouted, pointing toward a faint light in the distance, barely visible through the storm. The Whitmore ship. Reed steered toward it as carefully as he could, the small fishing boat rocking violently with every wave. Getting close enough to attempt a rescue in weather like this was nearly impossible. But turning back wasn't something any of them considered. As they approached, Elijah saw the ship drifting dangerously close to a cluster of sharp rocks near the shoreline, the kind that had destroyed boats for generations. "We need to get them off that ship now," Reed shouted, "before those rocks do." The two boats came together as close as the storm allowed, fishermen on both vessels working desperately to secure ropes between them. The waves kept pulling them apart every time they got close, like the ocean itself was fighting against the rescue. Elijah spotted Amelia near the railing of the larger ship, soaked and terrified, her father beside her. "Amelia!" he shouted, his voice barely cutting through the howling wind. She turned, and even through the chaos and the rain, she saw him. "Elijah!" she screamed back, relief and fear mixing together in her voice. The crew began the difficult process of transferring passengers between the two vessels, one at a time, using ropes and harnesses in conditions that made every single movement a risk to someone's life. Mason went first, the crew lowering him carefully despite his protests to let his daughter go before him. He landed safely on Reed's boat, soaked and shaking, immediately turning back toward the ship, watching desperately for his daughter. Then it was Amelia's turn. Her wheelchair couldn't make the transfer. She would need to be carried, harnessed safely, lowered carefully across the gap between two violently rocking boats. Elijah climbed back toward the ship himself, refusing to let anyone else handle this part. "I've got her," he said to Briggs's crew. "Let me bring her across." They secured a harness around both of them together. Amelia held tightly against his chest and began the slow, terrifying process of lowering them across the gap between the two boats. A massive wave crashed against them halfway through the transfer. The rope swung violently. Amelia screamed, gripping Elijah with everything she had. For one horrifying second, Elijah thought they were both going to be thrown into the dark water below, into waves that would swallow them whole within seconds. "Hold on to me," Elijah shouted over the wind. "Don't let go, no matter what." "I won't," Amelia screamed back, her arms wrapped so tightly around him that her entire body trembled with the effort. The rope swung back the other direction, and for a brief, terrifying moment, they were suspended directly above the churning black water, rain pouring down on them, wind screaming in their ears. "Elijah," Amelia gasped, her voice shaking, certain this might be her final moment. "If we don't make it, I need you to know something." "Don't," he said. "We're gonna make it." "Please," she begged. "Just in case. That night at the gala, when you knelt in front of me, you didn't just give me back my dignity. You gave me a reason to want to keep living. I fell in love with you, Elijah. I think I fell in love with you that very first night." Elijah's chest tightened, his eyes burning with tears that had nothing to do with the rain pouring down his face. "I fell in love with you too," he said, his voice breaking. "The moment you looked at me like I was more than just invisible. Like I actually mattered." Another massive wave crashed against the boats below them. The rope shook violently, and for one terrifying second, everything went still, suspended between life and death, between the words just spoken and whatever came next. Then the fishermen below pulled hard, fighting against the storm with everything they had, and finally, Elijah and Amelia were pulled safely onto Reed's boat. They collapsed onto the deck together, soaked, shaking, alive. Mason rushed to his daughter immediately, holding her tightly, tears mixing with rain on his face. "We're okay," Amelia whispered, holding on to both her father and Elijah at once. "We're okay." The journey back to the harbor felt like it took hours, the small boats fighting against the same brutal waves the entire way. But somehow, against every terrible odds, they made it. The entire town had gathered near the docks, watching the storm with desperate hope. Having heard that Captain Reed and a handful of fishermen had gone out against official orders to attempt a rescue nobody believed could succeed. When the boats finally appeared through the rain, cheers erupted along the docks. People who had whispered cruel rumors about Elijah just weeks earlier now cheered his name like he was the greatest hero the harbor had ever seen. Mayor Kane stood near the back of the crowd, his face tight with something that looked far more like fear than relief. Victor stood beside him, watching Elijah being celebrated by the entire town, his jealousy and desperation growing heavier with every cheer. Later that night, after Amelia and Mason were checked by doctors and declared safe, after the chaos of the rescue finally settled into exhausted relief, Captain Reed pulled Elijah aside in a quiet corner of the harbor office. His face was serious, heavier than Elijah had ever seen it. "There's something I need to tell you," Reed said. "Something I should have told you a long time ago, but I was too afraid of what it might mean." Elijah's heart began pounding again, a different kind of fear settling in. "What is it?" Reed took a deep breath, his old eyes filled with years of guilt he had carried in silence. "Your father didn't disappear in that storm 15 years ago," Reed said quietly. "He was murdered. And I think I finally understand why." The words hit Elijah like another massive wave, knocking the air straight out of his lungs. Behind them, The storm was finally beginning to fade, the wind softening, the rain slowing into a gentle drizzle. But for Elijah, the real storm was only just beginning. Elijah didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table until sunrise, Captain Reed's words echoing in his head over and over. Your father was murdered. For 15 years he had grieved a man lost to a storm, a tragedy. Bad luck. Nature taking something away the way it sometimes does. He had built his entire understanding of his father's death around that idea. Now everything had changed. Someone had taken his father on purpose. And whoever did it was still walking around Blackwater Harbor, maybe even smiling at him on the street, pretending nothing ever happened. Sophia found him there in the morning, still sitting in the same chair, his eyes red and hollow. Elijah, she said softly, sitting down beside him. What happened? Reed wouldn't tell me anything last night. He just said you needed time. Elijah told her everything. The murder, Reed's guilt, the years of silence. Sophia's hands trembled as she listened. All this time, she whispered, all this time we thought it was just bad luck, just a storm. It was never just a storm, Elijah said, his voice hardening. Someone used that storm to hide what they did to him. Captain Reed came back that afternoon, ready to explain everything he had carried alone for 15 years. I should have told you sooner, Reed said, sitting across from Elijah and Sophia at their small kitchen table. I was scared. The men involved were powerful. I had a family to protect. I told myself silence was the safer choice. Just tell us now, Elijah said. Please. Reed nodded, his old hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. Your father came to me about 2 weeks before the storm, Reed began. He was worried. He had noticed strange shipping patterns at the South Docks, boats arriving late at night, cargo that never matched the official paperwork. He thought something illegal was happening, something bigger than simple smuggling. The journal mentioned the South Docks, Elijah said, and the name Kane, multiple times. Reed's face tightened. Your father eventually figured out what was really being moved through those containers. It wasn't just stolen goods or illegal alcohol like some of the older smuggling operations in this region. It was people. The word hit the room like a physical blow. People? Sophia whispered. Human trafficking, Reed said quietly, the words clearly difficult for him to say even after all these years. Your father discovered a network moving people through Blackwater Harbor, hidden inside shipping containers meant for ordinary cargo. He found records, names, enough proof to expose the entire operation. Elijah felt sick. And Mayor Kane was involved? Mayor Kane built half his political career on cleaning up corruption in this harbor, Reed said. The truth is, he wasn't cleaning anything up. He was running it, using his position to protect the operation, making sure the right inspectors looked away, making sure the wrong questions never got asked. My father was going to expose him. He was 2 days away from taking everything he found to federal authorities outside the harbor, people who couldn't be bought or threatened the way local officials could. Reed said. He told me his plan the night before the storm hit. He wanted me to know, just in case something happened to him. And something happened to him, Elijah said, his voice shaking with anger now instead of grief. Reed nodded slowly. The storm gave them the perfect opportunity. Nobody would question a death during a hurricane that took several boats and several lives that same night. Your father's boat was found wrecked near the rocks, exactly where boats sometimes wreck during storms like that. Nobody looked closely enough to notice the engine had been tampered with before he ever left the dock. You knew this, Elijah said. All this time you knew, and you said nothing. I suspected, Reed said, his voice breaking slightly. I didn't have proof, and the men I suspected were powerful enough to destroy my career, maybe even my life, if I made accusations I couldn't prove. I'm not proud of my silence, Elijah. I've carried this guilt for 15 years, but your father's journal, the one you brought me, that gave me something I never had before. What's that? Confirmation, Reed said. Written proof in his own handwriting that he knew exactly what was happening before he died. That's not just suspicion anymore. That's evidence. While Elijah absorbed the weight of 15 years of buried truth, Sophia was already moving. She spent the next 2 days contacting former harbor workers, men who had retired years ago, men who no longer feared losing their jobs to the Kane family's influence. Many of them refused to talk at first, old fear still sitting heavy in their chests. But one by one, slowly, they began to open up. An old dock worker named Garrett, now in his 70s, finally agreed to speak with Sophia after she promised to protect his identity until he felt safe enough to come forward publicly. "I worked the South Docks back then," Garrett told her, sitting in his small living room, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke. "I saw things I was told never to mention. Trucks arriving at strange hours, men nobody recognized handling cargo that never went through normal inspection. One night I saw something I'll never forget." "What did you see?" Sophia asked gently. "People," Garrett said, his voice cracking. "Being moved out of containers in the middle of the night, looking terrified, looking exhausted. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself if I said anything, I'd lose my job. Maybe worse. I've regretted that silence every single day since." Sophia recorded everything, her hands trembling as she realized the size of what they were truly uncovering. Garrett wasn't the only one. 2 more former workers came forward that same week, each one adding another piece to the puzzle, each one confirming what Elijah's father had discovered 15 years ago. Sophia compiled everything carefully. Testimonies, financial records linking Mayor Kane to shell companies connected to the South Dock operations, the photograph showing the mayor with a known smuggler, and now finally, witnesses willing to speak about what they saw with their own eyes. It was enough to build a real case, but it still wasn't enough to guarantee justice. Not against a family as powerful as the Kanes. Victor felt the walls closing in around his family, and he panicked. He couldn't undo the rescue. He couldn't undo the hero status Elijah now held throughout the entire town. And now somehow, rumors were spreading that Sophia Carter was digging into old records connected to the storm 15 years ago. Victor decided drastic action was necessary. He met with 2 men his father occasionally used for difficult tasks, men who operated quietly outside the boundaries of normal law enforcement, men the Kane family kept on retainer for situations exactly like this one. "I need Elijah Carter removed from this town," Victor told them. "Quietly, if possible. Permanently, if necessary. But murder, even arranged carefully, carried enormous risk, especially with Elijah now a celebrated hero throughout Blackwater Harbor. Too many eyes were watching him after the hurricane rescue. Too many people would ask questions if something happened to him now. Victor needed something safer, something that would destroy Elijah without directly harming him. He decided on a different plan entirely. A week later, Harbor Police arrived at Elijah's house with a warrant for his arrest. "Elijah Carter," the officer said, "you're being charged with theft of Harbor Company funds and falsification of employment records." Elijah stood in his doorway, completely stunned. "What? That's insane. I've never stolen anything in my life." "We have documentation showing fraudulent transactions tied to your name," the officer said, clearly uncomfortable, but following orders from above. Sophia rushed forward, panic rising in her voice. "This is fake. Someone set this up." The officers, despite their own doubts, were required to follow procedure. Elijah was arrested that afternoon, handcuffed in front of his own home, in front of neighbors who watched in shocked silence, unsure what to believe. Victor had arranged for fabricated financial records, planted carefully through corrupt connections inside the Harbor Company, designed specifically to make Elijah look like a thief. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. But Victor was running out of options, and desperation makes men reckless. Amelia heard about the arrest within the hour. She rushed straight to the police station, her heart pounding with fear and fury. "This is a lie," she told the officers at the front desk. "Elijah has never stolen anything. Someone is framing him." "Miss Whitmore, we understand your concern, but the evidence presented to us appears legitimate," the officer explained carefully, clearly trying not to upset someone from such an influential family. "Then the evidence is fake," Amelia said firmly, "and I think I know exactly who created it." That night, sitting alone in her room, furious and desperate to help the man she loved, Amelia remembered something important. Weeks earlier, during one of Victor's many attempts to convince her to abandon Elijah, he had grown careless during an argument, frustrated and angry, revealing more than he intended. And Amelia, already suspicious of his intentions, had quietly recorded the entire conversation on her phone, just in case she ever needed proof of his true character. She had almost forgotten about it until this very moment. She found the recording and listened to it again carefully, her hands trembling. In the recording, Victor's voice was clear, frustrated, careless with anger. "You don't understand what's at stake here. My father's entire career, our family's entire future, depends on keeping certain things buried. Elijah's father almost destroyed everything 15 years ago. I'm not going to let his son finish the job." It wasn't a full confession, but it was enough. Enough to prove Victor knew far more than an innocent person should about events connected to Elijah's father's death. Amelia knew exactly what she needed to do. The next morning, instead of going to a local lawyer or local newspaper, sources easily influenced or silenced by the Kane family's local power, Amelia drove 3 hours to the nearest city with real investigative journalists and contacts in national media. She brought the recording, she brought Sophia's documentation, she brought everything they had uncovered so far. A respected investigative journalist named Diane Foster listened to everything Amelia presented, her expression growing more serious with every piece of evidence laid out before her. "This is significant," Foster said finally. Human trafficking allegations connected to a sitting mayor, backed by witness testimony and financial records, plus a recorded admission from his son. "This isn't just a local story anymore." "Can you help us?" Amelia asked. "Properly? Where the Kane family can't bury it or silence it?" "I can do better than help," Foster said. "I can make sure federal investigators see this within days, not months. Stories like this don't stay quiet once the right people start asking questions." Within 48 hours, federal investigators arrived in Blackwater Harbor. The arrival of federal agents sent shockwaves through the entire town. People who had quietly supported the Kane family for years suddenly found themselves distancing as fast as possible, terrified of being connected to whatever scandal was unfolding. Elijah was released from custody almost immediately once federal investigators reviewed the fabricated evidence against him, quickly identifying the falsified documents for exactly what they were. Mayor Kane attempted to control the narrative, calling press conferences, denying every accusation, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, orchestrated by people jealous of his family's success. But the evidence kept growing heavier every single day. More former workers came forward once they saw federal protection was real. Financial records, once carefully hidden, began surfacing through subpoenas the local government no longer had power to block. The photograph Sophia discovered became national news, displayed across television screens throughout the region. Victor tried desperately to distance himself from his father, claiming he knew nothing about any illegal activity, but the recording Amelia provided made that impossible to believe. Within 2 weeks, both Mayor Kane and Victor were formally charged. Human trafficking, corruption, obstruction of justice, fraud. The list of charges grew longer with each passing day, as investigators uncovered just how deep the corruption truly went. Standing outside the courthouse the day the charges were announced, Elijah held his father's journal in his hands, the very thing that started this entire investigation. Sophia stood beside him, tears streaming down her face, finally able to grieve their father properly, knowing the truth at last. Amelia rolled up beside them, reaching for Elijah's hand. "He didn't die for nothing," Elijah said quietly, looking down at the worn, water-damaged journal. "He died trying to protect people nobody else cared about, and now everyone knows it." "The whole town knows his name now," Amelia said softly, "not as a man lost to a storm, as a man who tried to do what was right, even when it cost him everything." Elijah looked at her, at the woman who had risked everything to help him find justice, who had fought just as hard for his family as she had fought for her own healing. "None of this would have happened without you," he said. "None of this would have happened without your father's courage," Amelia replied. "We just finished what he started." Behind them, cameras flashed as reporters captured the moment. The beginning of justice, finally arriving in Blackwater Harbor after 15 long years of silence. But for Elijah and Amelia, the cameras and the headlines mattered far less than the quiet relief settling into their chests. The truth was finally free, and so were they. 1 year had passed since the night Elijah knelt down in front of a wheelchair and asked a question nobody else dared to ask. 1 year since a single video changed 2 lives forever. Now Blackwater Harbor was preparing for a different kind of event. Not a celebration. Not yet. First, the town needed to face something it had avoided for 15 years. The truth. The public hearings began on a cold Monday morning, held in the largest hall the town had, the same hall that once hosted galas and parties for the wealthiest families in the harbor. Now it was filled with something different. Reporters, federal investigators, ordinary townspeople who finally felt safe enough to fill every seat and demand answers. Elijah sat in the front row, Sophia beside him, Captain Reed just behind them. Amelia sat close to Elijah, her hand resting in his, steady and unshaken. Mason Whitmore sat nearby as well, watching closely. No longer just a concerned father, but a man determined to see justice finally served for the family who had given his daughter back her life. Mayor Kane sat at the front of the hall, his lawyer beside him, his once confident posture now stiff and small. Victor sat a few feet away, his expression a mixture of anger and fear, the weight of everything finally catching up to him. The hearing began with Sophia's evidence. She stood at the front of the hall, her hand steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest, and presented everything she had gathered. The missing newspaper articles. The misfiled photograph showing Mayor Kane with a known smuggler. The financial records linking shell companies to the Kane family's personal accounts. For 15 years, Sophia said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, this town believed a storm took innocent lives and nothing more. We now know that storm was used to hide a murder, and an operation that hurt countless innocent people who never had a voice to speak for themselves. A murmur moved through the crowd. Then came the witnesses. Garrett, the old dock worker, stood slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he approached the front of the hall. For 15 years, he had carried his silence like a stone in his chest. Today, finally, he set it down. I saw people move through those containers, Garrett said, his voice cracking with emotion. Real people. Scared people. I told myself it wasn't my place to speak up. I was wrong. I've lived with that regret every day since, and I won't carry it silently any longer. 2 more former workers followed, each one adding testimony that painted a clearer, darker picture of exactly what had been happening beneath the surface of Blackwater Harbor for over a decade. Captain Reed spoke next, his voice heavy with 15 years of guilt finally being released into the open air. Elijah's father came to me 2 weeks before he died, Reed said. He told me everything he discovered. I should have spoken up the moment his boat was found wrecked. I let fear keep me silent. That silence helped protect the very people responsible for his death. I will regret that for the rest of my life. The hall remained completely silent as Reed sat back down, the weight of his confession settling over everyone present. Then came the recording. Amelia stood at the front of the hall, her wheelchair steady, her voice calm despite the nerves twisting inside her chest. I recorded this conversation months ago, she said, during an argument with Victor Kane. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Now I think everyone in this room will understand exactly what he meant. She played the recording through the hall's speaker system. Victor's voice, frustrated and careless, filled the silent room. You don't understand what's at stake here. My father's entire career, our family's entire future, depends on keeping certain things buried. Elijah's father almost destroyed everything 15 years ago. I'm not going to let his son finish the job. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Victor's face turned pale, then red, his hands clenching into fists as the entire town heard, in his own voice, exactly how much he had known, exactly how desperate he had been to keep the truth buried. Mayor Kane closed his eyes, finally understanding there was no path left that could protect his family from what was coming next. The federal investigators presented their final findings shortly after. Financial trails connecting Mayor Kane directly to the trafficking operation. Records showing payments made to harbor inspectors to ignore certain shipments. Documentation proving the South Dock warehouse had been used for over a decade to move people through Blackwater Harbor disguised as ordinary cargo. And finally, evidence connecting a tampered engine report to Elijah's father's boat. Proof that his death 15 years ago wasn't an accident caused by the storm, but a murder carefully disguised by it. The lead investigator stood before the room, his voice firm and final. Based on the evidence presented, Mayor Robert Kane is hereby charged with multiple counts of human trafficking, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accessory to murder. Victor Kane is charged with conspiracy, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. The hall erupted into a mixture of gasps, quiet cries, and finally, after 15 long years, something that sounded almost like relief. Officers moved forward to formally place both men under arrest. Mayor Kane didn't resist. He simply stood, his shoulders slumped, the weight of 15 years of secrets finally crushing him completely. As officers led him away, he looked once toward Elijah, his expression unreadable, somewhere between shame and something that almost resembled regret. Victor, however, wasn't ready to accept defeat quietly. "This isn't over," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation as officers restrained him. "You think a dead fisherman and his pathetic children can destroy everything my family built? You're nothing. You were always nothing." The hall went deadly silent. Elijah stood slowly, calm despite the venom in Victor's voice. "My father wasn't nothing," Elijah said quietly, his voice somehow carrying further than Victor's screaming had. "He was a man brave enough to stand up against people exactly like you and your father. And in the end, the truth he died protecting just destroyed everything you tried so hard to hide." Victor had nothing left to say. The officers led him away, his protests fading into the hallway outside, finally silenced after years of cruelty and manipulation. The same people who once feared the Kane name now watched both men disappear through the courthouse doors, their power finally completely broken. The weeks following the hearing changed Blackwater Harbor forever. Mason Whitmore established a foundation in honor of Elijah's father, dedicated to supporting families affected by maritime accidents and crimes hidden along the coastline. The foundation also funded support services for trafficking survivors throughout the region, ensuring what happened to so many innocent people would never be ignored or buried again. Captain Reed finally received public recognition for his decades of service to the harbor, along with formal acknowledgement of his crucial role in bringing the truth to light, despite his years of guilt over staying silent for so long. Sophia's reporting earned attention far beyond Blackwater Harbor. National publications reached out, offering her positions as an investigative journalist, the very dream she had quietly pursued in library basements, while nobody else believed her digging would ever matter. Amelia continued months of intensive physical therapy, building on the foundation Elijah had first given her that night at the gala. She wasn't fully healed. She would never be exactly the way she was before the storm, but slowly, carefully, she regained enough strength to stand for short periods on her own, something doctors from 3 different cities once told her was impossible. Elijah remained exactly who he always was: quiet, steady, kind to everyone around him, even after becoming the most well-known man in the entire harbor. A year to the day after the gala that changed everything, Blackwater Harbor held its festival once again. The same hall, the same harbor view, the same tradition of opening the night with the ceremonial captain's dance. But everything else felt different. This time, the entire town gathered not with whispers of pity or cruelty, but with genuine warmth and respect. Amelia arrived in a soft blue dress, her wheelchair beside her, but this time surrounded by people who genuinely smiled when they saw her, without the cruel glances of years before. Mason stood at the front of the room once again, just like he had 1 year earlier, his heart pounding with an entirely different kind of hope this time. "Tonight," he said, his voice steady and proud, "I would like my daughter to open the ceremonial captain's dance." The room fell silent, just like before. But this silence felt completely different. Elijah stepped forward immediately, without hesitation, without anyone laughing or mocking the moment. He walked across the same floor he had crossed exactly 1 year earlier, when nobody knew his name, when nobody believed a quiet security guard could change anything. He knelt down in front of Amelia, just like that first night, his eyes finding hers with the same steady warmth that had given her hope when she had none left. "Miss Whitmore," he said softly, the same words from a year ago. "Would you still like that dance?" Amelia's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of pure happiness. "Always," she whispered. With careful, practiced movements, built from months of therapy and quiet determination, Amelia rose to her feet, steadier now than she had been that very first night, though still leaning gently on Elijah's strength beside her. The room erupted into applause as they began to dance, slow and careful, but undeniably real, undeniably beautiful. Two people who had survived storms both literal and personal, standing together exactly where their story first began. Fireworks began lighting up the harbor sky outside the windows, the entire town stepping out onto the balconies to watch the colors burst above the water. And there, beneath the fireworks, surrounded by the entire town that once doubted them both, Elijah knelt down once again, this time not to help her stand. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ring, his hands trembling slightly with nerves despite everything they had already survived together. "Amelia Whitmore," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I never imagined someone like you would change my entire life the way you have. I love you more than I ever thought possible. Will you marry me?" Amelia, steady on her feet for the first time in years, looked down at him with tears streaming freely down her face. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with happiness. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." The crowd erupted into cheers, fireworks continuing to light up the sky above them, the entire harbor celebrating not just a marriage proposal, but the end of 15 years of buried secrets, and the beginning of something neither Elijah nor Amelia ever thought they would find. Months later, on a quiet morning overlooking the harbor, a new building opened its doors for the very first time. The Carter Maritime Academy, a school built specifically for children from poor families, disabled sailors looking for new opportunities, and anyone the harbor's old systems had once ignored or pushed aside. Sophia stood at the entrance, now a respected journalist, helping cut the ribbon alongside her brother. Captain Reed stood proudly nearby, finally given the chance to teach young sailors the same skills he had spent decades mastering, free from the corruption that once silenced him. Amelia, walking now with a steady cane for support rather than relying entirely on her wheelchair, stood beside Elijah, watching children excitedly explore their new school for the very first time. Above the entrance hung a simple plaque, the words carefully chosen to honor everything that brought them to this moment. "The sea keeps every secret for a time. The truth always returns with the tide." Elijah looked at the plaque, then at Amelia, then at the children running happily through halls built specifically to give them opportunities nobody had ever given his own father. "He would be proud," Amelia said softly, squeezing his hand. "He would be proud of all of us," Elijah replied, watching the harbor sparkle under the morning sun. The same harbor that once took everything from him, now finally giving something back. The storm that started this story was long gone. But what it left behind, the truth, the courage, the love built from quiet kindness in a room full of cruelty, that would remain in Blackwater Harbor for generations to come. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and your favorite moment in the story. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like this. We tell stories about people who turned their pain into power. And trust me, there are more coming. See you in the next one.